Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're totally decoding the 2026 National Defense Strategy. And look, we aren't just going to read through a bunch of dry military jargon here. We're getting right into the heavy stuff, the geographic and philosophical debates at the very core of this document. We really have to ask, does this strategy simply protect a nation, or does it quietly draw the borders of an empire?
Okay, let's dive into this with a really fascinating quote from our source material. Professor Jiang says, "It is not only a military document, it is a map of power." And that hits the nail on the head, right? A defense strategy actually reveals a ton about a nation. It shows us exactly what a country fears, what it absolutely wants to control, and honestly, who it expects to pay the price for its plans. It's literally a blueprint for global influence.
So according to the document, the official strategy rests on 5 core pillars: defending the homeland, securing the Western Hemisphere, deterring China, making allies step up and do more, and finally, rebuilding the defense industrial base. Now, before we go any further, let's explore the massive philosophical debate behind each one of these.
Which brings us to our first major tension. When a powerful nation loudly declares it's putting its own interests first, where exactly is the line between legitimate self-defense and, well, dominating everybody else? This isn't just an academic question. It directly impacts global stability, the economy, and ultimately, your future safety. So we have to ask, is America First actually a defense strategy, or is it an imperial one in disguise?
There are two totally competing realities here. On one hand, you have the official defensive justification, often echoed by figures like Donald Trump, arguing this is strictly about protecting borders, locking down fair trade deals, and securing peace through strength, basically making sure the nation isn't getting ripped off. But then, on the flip side, critics like Noam Chomsky argue there's no way this isn't classic imperial language. They say that when you define security so broadly that it includes controlling global trade routes and endlessly pushing out your security perimeter, well, that's hegemony, not defense.
Our sources actually bring in a brilliant warning from George Washington. He famously cautioned that a republic must not confuse self-defense with appetite. It's such a great point. He was warning that a free people just can't flourish if they're constantly in a state of alarm. If a nation starts looking at every rival as a mortal enemy and every single trade route as a potential battlefield, it really risks losing its restraint and destroying its own peace from the inside out.
Okay, moving on to the map. Geographically speaking, this strategy puts a massive emphasis on the Western Hemisphere. But that naturally tees up our second major dilemma. Does securing the Western Hemisphere actually protect the homeland, or is it just a framework to dominate the neighbors?
To really understand this, we've got to rewind to the Monroe Doctrine. Originally, this was pitched as a defensive shield, right? A big warning sign telling European empires to stay out of the Americas. But over time, as strategic thinkers in our source point out, critics argue this doctrine kind of morphed into an American claim of ownership. Fast forward to today, and control over places like the Caribbean, the Panama Canal, and local ports isn't just viewed as keeping foreign threats at bay. For a lot of smaller nations, it feels like a much heavier controlling hand.
We really see two completely different worldviews colliding here. Theodore Roosevelt famously took the stance that great power demands great responsibility, that keeping hostile forces out of your backyard is just absolute necessity. But contrast that with Simón Bolívar, who warns that smaller republics don't shed one empire just to be babysat and restricted by a new one. In that view, if you're a smaller country and you can't even pick your own trading partners or run your own ports without being treated as a security threat, are you really sovereign?
Thinker John Quincy Adams sums up this tension in our source by pointing out that true security defends independence. It doesn't limit it. Critics argue that the moment a strategy asks neighbors to live like guests in their own homes, it crosses the line from security into empire. Protection simply cannot become permission to rule.
Now let's pivot and look across the Pacific to the strategy's primary military competitor. This sparks another huge debate. Is containing China a case of genuine deterrence, or is it a modern form of economic strangulation?
And this brilliantly illustrates how the exact same policies can look night and day different depending on where you're sitting. From Washington's vantage point, this is classic defensive deterrence. Strategists like Henry Kissinger and George Kennan frame it as preventing regional coercion and just keeping sea lanes open for everybody. But look at it from Beijing's perspective. As articulated by the historical voice of Zhou and Enlai in our text, this feels like an absolute siege. To them, naval encirclement, fortifying island chains, and slapping heavy restrictions on semiconductor chips look exactly like an attempt to choke out their economic future.
But what about everyone else? For the smaller Asian nations caught in the crossfire, the stakes are totally different. Our source quotes the late leader of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who said, "A policy is not judged only by what it says, it is judged by what it makes others prepare for." These nations really just want to survive, trade, and grow. They absolutely do not want to be crushed between two giants or forced to pick sides in a new Cold War.
So, what does the strategy actually demand from international partners? Well, it lays out some pretty specific, rapid-fire directives. Europe has to do more for its own defense. Japan and South Korea need to seriously expand their military roles in Asia. NATO members must up their spending. The bottom line? The stated goal is for partners to stop being so dependent on the United States.
But asking allies to do more forces us to ask a really critical question. Are these allies genuinely being treated as partners? Are they dependents? Or are they just pawns? Is this really about shared responsibility? Or is it a superpower quietly shifting its own strategic risks onto the shoulders of smaller countries? Dwight D. Eisenhower argued for genuine partners, saying an alliance requires real capacity and shared burdens from everyone involved. But dissident leaders like Václav Havel and historical figures like Empress Myeongseong point to a much darker dynamic. They argue that if smaller nations are the ones actually absorbing the danger for a strategy cooked up half a world away, well, they aren't partners. They're frontline pawns being moved around a board.
The philosopher Hannah Arendt perfectly frames the risk here. She says, "The danger is thoughtlessness. Everyone performs a role. No one asks who designed the stage." The core argument is absolutely crucial. For an alliance to truly work, allied citizens have to hold on to their moral agency. They can't just surrender their judgment and accept being a forward operating base in a conflict they didn't even choose.
All right, let's look at the physical reality of making this happen, rebuilding the defense industrial base. To actually build this global map of power, the strategy calls for a massive effort. We're talking expanding shipyards, locking down supply chains, drastically ramping up munitions, mass-producing advanced drones, and essentially mobilizing the national economy.
But here's the thing. Building all these physical tools requires trillions of tax dollars. It literally ties your wallet directly to these global policies, and that brings us to our final dilemma. Does completely tying a nation's economy, politics, and jobs to weapon production actually create security? Or does it accidentally create a permanent incentive for war?
Once again, we have two completely clashing views. Franklin D. Roosevelt championed the arsenal of democracy, this noble, visible mobilization needed to survive a crisis and deter bad actors. But then you have General Smedley Butler, who famously called war a racket. His harsh critique was that once your communities, your jobs, and massive corporate profit margins depend on military contracts, the defense industry gets way too much political power. The terrifying risk is that an industry built to fight enemies might eventually literally need enemies just to keep the factories running.
Martin Luther King Jr. brought a really profound moral argument to this. He noted that organizing a whole economy around war reshapes the actual soul of a society. He said, "A nation that can mobilize for war can mobilize for schools. If it cannot, the obstacle is not capacity, it is priority." It really makes you think. Prioritizing weapons over human development might leave a society heavily armed, but fundamentally broken and insecure.
Reverend Sun Myung Moon offers a concluding thought in our text. Strategy must be judged by conscience. The big takeaway here is that if a nation just builds weapons, strong-arms its allies, and treats every rival as a permanent enemy, all without a moral center focused on peace, it's only going to deepen the global crisis, not fix it. Strength has to serve peace.
So, as we wrap up, yes, every nation absolutely has the right to defend itself. But after decoding the strategy today, we're left with a lingering thought. Can a great power rebuild its strength without turning the entire world into a battlefield? Does this document truly protect the homeland, or is it quietly mapping out a much more dangerous, unstable empire? I'll leave you to weigh the evidence on that one. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep asking the hard questions.